All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Cam Cormilo. I'm an assistant professor in the IT Analytics and Operations Department here at Mendoza. So I'd like to welcome you to the first of a three-part panel series on AI for society. So I'll give you just a brief background on what we're doing here, what the goal of the panel is, introduce our brilliant panelists for today, and then we'll jump into questions. So the idea for this kind of came about because of the fact that today much of the conversation around AI is focused on risk, right? How to prevent harm, how to responsibly manage these technologies, and really kind of how to slow down. And these are absolutely essential questions that need answering. But a complementary question to that is what this series is trying to answer, right? The idea of asking what it might look like to design and deploy and govern AI systems that actively contribute to human well-being and to society. So across the series, we are going to be exploring how AI might benefit individuals, communities, cultures, and what values beyond just harm avoidance should shape its development. So today's panel, Designing AI for Human Growth, focuses on one really important dimension to that broader theme, where we ask how AI can actually enhance rather than replace human capacities. So how might it cultivate learning or deepen empathy, expand creativity or strengthen human judgment instead of diminishing those same values? So it's not just a conversation about making smarter machines or making safer machines or kind of those normal conversations around AI. It's about how we can actually become better humans through AI and how kind of the responsibility we carry as designers and researchers and policymakers to shape AI towards that goal. So I'll start with a couple of introductions, although our panelists need no introductions. First, of course, is Nitesh Chawla. So as founding director of the Lucy Family Institute for Data and Society and newly appointed director of the university's Data, AI, and Computing Initiative, he's a leading voice in harnessing data science for the common good. He once described his journey into academia as a romantic itch for research. And that itch has since become a defining intellectual drive, expanding the boundaries of computing and leading AI-driven initiatives addressing challenges from childhood malnutrition to substance addiction. I didn't talk about a seating arrangement. Sorry. Come back here. We'll start out here at the beginning. So we have Santosh Kumar Gautam, Associate Professor of Development and Global Health Economics and Director of the Doctoral Program in Sustainable Development. An influential applied microeconomist, he studies the biological and structural poverty traps that constrain human potential. His research shows how early life investments from micronutrient fortification to rural infrastructure lay the foundation for long-term human capital. Through his commitment to evidence-based, citizen-centric policies, Santosh brings a critical empirical perspective to designing AI that empowers the most marginalized. And then, of course, our third panelist here, Dr. Amit Abbasi, an acclaimed scholar whose work has shaped the field of human-centered analytics. As co-director of the Human-Centered Analytics Lab and founding academic director of Notre Dame's PhD program in analytics, he has spent more than 20 years bridging what he calls the last research mile, the critical transition where technology moves from academic rigor to real-world impact. His work exemplifies our theme of designing AI for human growth, from smarter security alerts that foster critical thinking to digital biomarker tools that reduce mental health practitioner bias. And finally, our last panelist is Ron Matoyer, Notre Dame's Vice President and Associate Provost for Teaching and Learning, a nationally recognized pioneer of human-centered design. He works to ensure technology serves our most vulnerable communities. His research ranges from mitigating implicit bias in high-stakes decisions to developing food agentic technologies that empower families in food deserts. He has traced his passion for computing to a formative moment where he was taught coding in a makeshift computer lab inside of a convent closet. This early exposure to the power of volunteer mentorship and equitable access has become a foundation for his career, and it continues to shape his work designing AI systems that cultivate human, and more specifically now, student agency. So let's give a round of applause. So I did have Google Gemini do a deep research report on each of them so that I could try to find little facts about them to include in their bios there. A couple of you are a little bit more private than I would have liked, so I did my best with what I had. But so I'm going to start off just with a brief question for each of you to answer. In maybe 30 seconds, when you think about AI and human growth, what specific human capacity has the greatest potential to be strengthened by AI?
You want me to go first? You're the one who said you're teaching humans and now students. Yeah. Students were not humans, that was wrong. Just picking on the
That's fine. You know, a specific human capacity to me is hard. I think it depends on the human. I think each person has different ways that they might be benefited by. You know, if you're a person who struggles with certain social situations or recognizing certain cues, you could imagine AI being kind of an assistant to you, right? Recognizing those situations and giving you some understanding of how to respond in those situations. So I think it really depends on the human.
I guess I think that's a trick question. Did you get Gemini to help you with that? So one of my favorite articles that came out in the last few years, I think came out in 2023 in Science, and it's from members of actually CAM's in my research community. These are like labor economists for IS, like Eric Jolston and company. It's called GPTs or GPTs, right? So the fact that the reason we're all here right now is that AI is a general purpose technology. This is an AI revolution on the same scale as the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, which means it doesn't just allow betterment of one factor or one dimension, right? It can help us in so many ways and harm us in so many ways as well, which is also why we're here, I think. So I think it's hard to pinpoint one thing. So that's sort of a all of the above answer. Sorry.
So I will bring my perspective from economics. I'll start with 4 challenges the world is facing. So as of now, 800 million people are living in extreme poverty, which is they're surviving on less than $3 per day per person. About in India, the data from India, almost 45% of 5th graders, they are not able to learn the maths or English text from grade 2. So there's a learning crisis. We call it learning poverty as well. In terms of hidden hunger, if we look at the global number, about almost close to 55% of under 5 children, they are suffering from some form of micronutrient deficiency, be it stunting, less height, low weight. And finally, we also know that every year, 5 million children below age 5, they die. And as I'm talking now, every minute, about 10 children in this world, somewhere in this world, they're dying. And I think AI can help solve some of these problems, can help address some of these challenges in terms of expanding foundational literacy at early life. It can also help reduce child mortality as well. So I think AI can play a very important role in improving capabilities, expanding capabilities, or also improving healthcare access to tackle some of these problems at a global level.
So I chose to go at the end because I wanted to see how their brilliance increases my capacity to answer. So I'm leaning on them to coax me in the right direction. But that's a good call. The way I look at it is there's sort of 2 ways of looking at capacity, right? So if we imagine the general, like as what Ahmed was talking about, or even Ron too, there are these tools available to us. We can lean on them to optimize email, marketing, certain activities, certain tasks and shows that we can build these agents for. And we have companies like OpenAI, fully investing into agentic AI architectures and what have you, to sort of replace or supplant some of the tasks, etc. So the question that I have for all of us here, imagine if something takes you, 8 hours a day, and now you can get it done in 4 hours. A real measure of human capacity is what will we do with the 4 hours we are given? Do we have an answer for that? In terms of our own intrinsic capacity to be creative, our capacity to do higher order thinking, our capacity to take on other things that help ourselves and the organizations. And I'll give you an example. So one of my PhD students, one day I saw him, these bots we have outside, right? Yeah, Jonathan knows who I'm talking about, picking up food from them. And I asked him, why are you getting food? And he said, very proudly, it saves me 20 minutes, 25, or saves me an hour, 20 minutes to go, 20 minutes to come back, 20 minutes to eat, wherever I'm going. I'm like, great. But what about the money that you may spend? He said that some of us pool in, so the money is an extra to get those Grubhub rewards. Then I asked him, how many of you do it? He said, a handful of us. Then I asked him, okay, together, you all are saving 5 hours a day. In a week, you're saving 40 hours. I'm getting 2 free PhD students. I pay for your Grubhub. But the paper output hasn't increased. So the idea that I'm saving an hour, it's convenience, but when do we convert that convenience or that time save into something? And he's taking the joy away from going out to eat, right? Going out, sitting and hanging out and being social versus he's taking it as I saved an hour because I was being efficient. And the second, so that to me is a general AI. We haven't figured out how we sort of embrace that capacity. And the other capacity is the problems that Santosh, that's why I sort of went in the end because I needed the brilliance to pick on. Santosh talked about childhood development. I genuinely believe the future would be, and this is where as academics, we could be very successful, specific problems that need solving, that no big AI company would be interested in because it doesn't have money. No big AI company will go to India or any other country and say, let me solve in this specific state, this malnutrition problem, because there's no money in it. But this is where academics have a role to play in increasing human capacity to solve, capacity of not-for-profits, capacity of individuals, understanding what problem needs to be solved, understanding how we may scale. So those are different ways I look at conversational capacity.
Thank you all. Ron, let's go back to you. You've spoken a lot in the past on design justice. What would design justice require of AI systems that traditional just human-centered design doesn't, right? Particularly when power is involved or structural inequalities.
So I guess, human-centered design to me is paying attention to the human, right? The individual, as you're going through your design process and you're involving them in that design process, you're letting the human drive the needs and so on and so forth. When I think of design justice, I think of a particular focus on marginalized populations. Right? And so you're not focusing on just any human, you're focusing on a specific group of humans who are marginalized in some way. And you're bringing them into the process of design, right? So they're driving the questions that are being asked and they're participating and helping develop the answers. And, just in general research and independent of AI, that requires that as a researcher, you be willing to, first of all, pivot, because I might write a grant proposal that says, I'm going to go study this thing with this community group that I'm working with here in South Bend. But I might find out in the first week that their problems are very different than what I had anticipated. And so you have to pivot because they are driving the research. And so that requires that your funding agencies also be willing to understand that kind of work and be able to make those kinds of pivots. So to me, that's kind of what design justice work is. And whether it's AI or whatever your whatever technologies you're using and designing for, it requires that kind of engagement and driving focus by the people that you're designing for and designing with, and specifically marginalized populations.
So design justice, right? Designing for the most marginalized. Santosh, in your work, you kind of highlight this idea of the last person as the most marginalized and vulnerable. So if we did take the design justice approach and we designed for those most vulnerable populations, what might that look like? Rather than designing for the average person, we're taking on the perspective of the last person. What would we change when we design or deploy or govern the systems?
Yeah, I think I'll again go back to my 4 initial problems. And in my research, I mostly focus on the people who are below poverty line. And I think one example I can share is in the early 90s, economic growth used to be considered as a panacea for poverty alleviation. And the hope was that economic growth in any country will increase the size of the pie, and even the poorest sections in the society will benefit from that. That did not happen. That example can be applied to AI as well. Whether AI is very inclusive, is it only catering to the median or the average workers or performers or the students? And in terms of design, I think my worry is that this new technology, maybe the poor people are not left behind. They should be a part of this inclusive access to technology, which includes AI as well. So the last person word, I think it has come from Mahatma Gandhi in India, where they're concerned about we should provide the food, shelter, and all the resources to the last person in the line, the queue. And I think the problems that I outlined in the beginning, if we ask a question, does this technology work for the person who is least connected, who is the poorest on this planet, and who does not have connectivity, would this technology help that person or not? That approach would be more inclusive, would reduce the barrier and also the inequality. Because I also have this other worry that this might widen the gap, the inequality among haves and haves not, because someone who has access to use these resources, use this technology may benefit. So there might be a skill bias, expansion of human capabilities because of unequal access to AI. So to respond to your question, I mean, we need to be careful when we are designing the AI system that keep in mind the poor person, keep in mind the people who are not fully literate, so and people who are not connected to online all the time. Whether this system will work in the offline connectivity or not. It should also be culturally inclusive and appropriate. Multilingual AI access and in the local language AI access could also be helpful to reduce the gap between rich and the poor people.
We'll move over to Nitesh. In your work, where have you seen AI most clearly amplify human judgment rather than override it?
So, I mean, there's different, works that we do, whether we are, in talking about the last person of being inclusive in terms of technology, so we have the Lucy Family Institute, and which was also the focus of the conference, is responsible, inclusive, safe, and empowering AI, Rise AI, construct, but, and so the work that we're doing in Mexico with pediatric cancer patients, or with Colombia on the Peace Accord, with Clark Institute, or with the city of South Bend on proactive governance and even the lead mitigation, etc. And those things, they are truly amplifying. However, I'll share a story about something which I learned. So my son, Ahan, who's a freshman here, and he really wants to work with this guy, Ahmed Abbasi. He's not a star. My son said, I wouldn't waste my time with you, but I want to shoot. So he and my niece, my son was 17 years old that time, was a rising freshman last summer, and my niece is a 15-year-old in high school, is a rising junior now. He wanted to go to finance. My niece wants to do the same thing. And before the summer, they came up with this brilliant idea, like no one has thought. They'll use AI to predict stock market. They thought they'll become very rich. Then I said, okay, I'm going to put some money away if you can make. I didn't tell them that, they might be the last person on the line thinking about the idea. But anyhow, so they started that journey, and they had no clue what they were doing. They knew what they wanted to do. Their hypothesis was, if they can collect sentiments of the news on how people in the news are talking about a company, next day they'll buy or sell the stock. Right, the very next morning. Like, all right, it's a reasonable hypothesis that a news sentiment would be a lead indicator. So then they use ChatGPT to curate, to get all the news and do sentiment scoring. Then they use ChatGPT to help them write code, or whatever they were using, I forget now. Help them write code for the downloading to basically curate the ETFs. Anyway, closing prices of stock market over the last 1 year in San. And then they got stuck. So then they reached out to him, seeing if Gregory is in the room. He's not. Gregory, one of my PhD students, and Joe, a postdoc. And then they got stuck with what they could do. they reached out to them and said, hey, would you meet with us regularly, please, so we can get through it? And we have 60 days to make money. And if we make money, we'll give you a piece. They agreed, of course. Who wouldn't, right? So then they did that. The models didn't work or what have you. But then they wrote a paper together, right? Which I've read the paper. I think they've done a fantastic job in the paper. And they talked about AI as a co-mentor for the, and that gave me an insight into how these 16, 17, 18-year-old kids are looking at it. What they argued in the paper, even what they talked about now, is they used AI to get over the initial hump of setting up certain things. And then they knew what they didn't know. And then they met with Gregory Joe every single day. They had these sprint meetings where they learned how to set up certain things, and they worked things together. They accelerated their learning. They figured out how to set GitHub repositories and all that. And they did experiments, and they figured out how to, how to think about certain problems. They achieved what they could have achieved in 60 days, but they could not have achieved over the year, right? In how they spent a lot of time on it. But then we continued working with them over the fall and spring semester until we just got a paper accepted in the American Society of Engineering Education, where the title of the paper is AI as a co-mentor, and without any revisions, right? They just got it accepted. Usually there's a lot of revisions required to get into that place. So that to me was how they realized that what AI can do, and they figured out what they needed a human to teach them and go deep into explaining to them. So that was an example of how I've seen AI being used, and I thought that was very informative as a mechanism of learning. They weren't expecting to write that paper about it. They just wanted to make money. And they're still disappointed that their model isn't making money. Paper couldn't matter. I'm telling you, like all of us in the room who care about the paper, most shame on us. We should be thinking about predicting stock market.
Did you tell them they'd be making money if they'd use Gemini?
I didn't tell him. So that's why he said, I'm going to work with Ahmed Abbasi. He'll teach them how to write better models to make money.
Well, natural transition, Ahmed. He gave me a little bit of a hard time because I sent them the questions ahead of time. He said they're too difficult, and then I didn't even answer them.
Too difficult to no answer keys. Sorry, just
Yeah. So I'll ask you this intentionally difficult question. In your opinion, do you think that AI systems should ever intentionally play a role in shaping users' moral development? And if so, how do we ensure that we're cultivating autonomy rather than constraining it?
Yeah. You guys hear that? It's funny, as soon as I read that, like that moment of my light flashed before my eyes when I upset Cam last year, triggered this question. No. So I'm going to say it depends, right? And so it depends. For those of you, and the Devaish's son is figuring this out in the business school, the first thing we teach our students is the importance of understanding this concept of it depends. Because a lot of situations in life have nuance. The second thing we teach them is that they're ready to now get an internship at a top consulting firm because that's what they need to do when they get there. But no, I think it depends for a few reasons. I'm going to try to spell this out. I couldn't help but notice, by the way, that there's a food connection here, right? Cam, you were an aspiring chef for a long time. Ron's done some really impactful work with your mobile apps and food deserts. I know both of you have studied malnutrition. I like to eat, so we've got it actually there, right? But when you think about the concept of food, food is not just food, right? There's processed food, there's organic food, you have GMO, non-GMO. So I think the three reasons it depends is, well, first of all, your question is getting at the fabric of the human condition, so to speak, and how we go beyond performance and productivity, right? Morality is something so central to our norms, our culture, faith, beliefs, and so forth, right? But at the same time, when we answer a question, should it do it? How should it do it? I think just like food is heterogeneous, the human condition is profoundly heterogeneous as well. There's a lot of heterogeneity there. And let's go even before Gen AI. We were all talking about in 2022 how algorithms were creating bubbles and filters and info levels and so forth. And so we've already got society where there's a lot of disparities, right? And we've got, I would say we've got AMOs, right? Not GMOs, but AMOs, algorithmically modified organisms, right? This is pre-Gen. And so because we have all this heterogeneity, there, and you kind of alluded to this, English, like with the opportunity, if you're thinking about people that are really been disadvantaged historically, well, it depends on what group you're talking about. We know in our research, many of us study mental health, many of us study aging populations. Loneliness is at an all-time high. Despair is at an all-time high. And so I would say that because of all this heterogeneity, the demand for AI to in sort of fill the gap around the human condition is already it's loud and clear. We already know this is happening, right? We need it. So that's the first thing. So it depends on what we're talking about, which segment of society and so forth, right? I think the second thing it depends on is, I did say a little while ago, GPTs are GPTs, but that was so 2023, and no one remembers what I said 15 minutes ago anyway, right? But now, and Nitesh alluded to this, McKinsey just announced, I think this week, that like we have 25,000 agents. So Gen AI is, so just like GPTs are GPTs, Gen AI is no longer going to be Gen AI moving forward, right? So it's no longer just a general AI, it's all about contextualization. What do we use the AI for, right? And so that matters here because the question, there's a lot of nuance in the context. And also, we know that it's not just about AI exposure, it's about AI substitution sometimes. So automation versus augmentation is an element of that contextualization. So that's sort of the second point. And then, the third, I guess, related to this is also, it's going to depend upon, sorry, I think I had something here about this as well. Sorry, I forget what the third point was, my bad. I've forgotten now. But so my context window isn't long enough. But
8,064 tokens.
Yes. So it's going to depend on substitution and context. Sorry, so substitution, so automation, augmentation, context is a group. So now let's come back to what those three depends. Let's quickly just come back to this, right? So the question was morality and should it be providing this evidence? Well, I think many people in this room, I'm going to go on the limb here, would say that, if a guidance counselor at a Catholic school wants to get assistance from a Catholic LLM to help a student who is maybe struggling with their faith, most of us would say, hey, that could be a really good example of augmenting a process with a language model where it might provide guidance on morality, right? In fact, there's people in this room working on this problem. There's people working with the Vatican on this problem, right? On the other hand, a lot of the same people in this room might feel, well, maybe if in that same Catholic school, Gemini, should a student be allowed to use Gemini to write their assignment about Catholic social teaching, setting aside the ethical aspect of it, we might have a very different feeling about it, right? So it depends on the context. What are the subgroup, automation versus augmentation, and also the context, right? So I think it really depends, and that's sort of what we're seeing in our research, and that's why a lot of us here are understanding the nuance of the situation when we apply it.
Ron, we'll jump back to you. So Santosh talked about learning, right? It's a really kind of valuable opportunity we have with AI. How do you view in your role as associate provost for teaching and learning, how do you view AI in an education realm and how it might interfere with this idea that when we learn, there's necessary friction there, right? We have to struggle to learn. A lot of times AI might get rid of that friction, right? Make us struggle less. How do we kind of overcome that? And when do we maybe intentionally introduce that friction back in when we have these AI tools?
Yeah, I mean, we've all gone through lots of education, so we know the value of that struggle, right? Or at least I do. I'm guessing some of these folks don't struggle a whole lot when they're learning, but I certainly remember some of those days, particularly in some math and physics courses where, you're working on a problem and you're just, beating on it for a long time, trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And so there's certainly this concept of productive struggle and times when it's good and times when it's not so good and so on, right? But I also think that very often the struggle is designed in by people who know what they're doing, right? Like people who know something about pedagogy, and they've determined how they're going to give this student or their class, a sequence of problems to work on. such that, it gets them to think about things in certain ways, and it gives them opportunities to struggle and to work through that. And so, I think there's a lot of value in that struggle. And I think it's particularly valuable when somebody's thought about it and designed for that struggle to happen in an effective way. And, finding that sweet spot between, what should students be able to do independently and what should they, need a little guidance on, and so on. And so I guess when I think about AI tools for education and being used in education, my first thought goes to, we need to have experts involved in designing those. And I don't mean AI experts. I mean, in this case, pedagogy experts, learning science people, cognitive scientists, people who know something about learning and the process of learning should be deeply involved in the design of any system that have to do with trying to help somebody learn a topic, right? And when a student sits down and just asks questions to Gemini or ChatGPT, they're just getting answers back, right? And even then, I don't know if I guess a student certainly can be, I think, savvy enough to ask questions in such a way that they are not trying to just get an answer back, but they're trying to develop their thinking throughout. But I think more often than not, they're just getting answers back, right? And so if we're going to use AI in these situations where we want it to be part of a learning tool, I think we need to really think carefully and get experts involved to get pedagogical and learning theory into these systems.
Else want to chime in on that?
I mean, actually, I agree with you. Friction, I think that's really perfect. It's necessary, and a struggle is necessary. However, if I harken back to 10 years ago when I was in high school, right? No, whatever. But when I was in high school, there was no Khan Academy YouTube, right? Where we could go and figure out to do certain things. We couldn't Google, and so there were no shortcuts available. Even pre-AI age, if you think about, AI as a field has existed forever. The Gen AI, the generative AI, LLMs that we're talking about, which are mainstreamed in maybe 3 or 4 years. 2 or 3 years is most of them trying to use it. The challenge, Ron, is that these tools steadily became available, where I could go online, look at something. So there were shortcuts. Now with Gen AI, the shortcut is the answer, right? Which was not the case when we were, at least you and I were in school.
Yeah.
Most folks maybe much younger. When you and I were in school. So why didn't we have this sort of conversation about learning pedagogy and everything else while we had Khan Academy available to help us learn certain things, or Google search available to help us get hints? The struggle started getting reduced. Did we become more stupid over time because of these things? I don't think so. Right? So I think there might be something there for us to figure out. With Gen AI, we may be getting the answers, yes.
Yeah, getting the answers isn't the same as learning, right?
Yeah.
So we certainly get the answers quickly now.
Yeah.
But does that mean that we're learning if we're getting the answers? And I think that's the part that's the hard question. Like,
The friction started getting reduced or removed.
Yeah, and so there's very little friction to getting the answers these days.
Yeah.
So what is that going to do to actual learning?
Then you have to make questions like that.
Yeah.
That Ahmed was saying that you can. By the way, it depends. Now I know. After my son started college, he's a Mendoza kid. He comes home, we ask him something, he says it depends. Thank you.
Can I just add one thing though? This is sort of just a plug for Ron, and I promise he didn't pay me yet, but there will be a check in the mail on this meeting. But so 3 of us are, I think, on this whatever AI committee that. So I just want to note that what Ron just said, he doesn't just talk the talk; he actually walks the walk. So I know, like with ND Learning, I've seen these meetings where they're talking about how when AI is being added to the process, like with Alex Ambrose and others, and what struck me is they're measuring the outcomes. And they're comparing it to the literature of what that process looked like and those outcomes look like pre-AI. And I've seen that presented in some of the meetings. So thank you for doing that. The rest of us are just trying to give you sound bites, but or at least I am.
So maybe if we draw on, the tools that we had prior to AI, we could just have ChatGPT degrade us in the same way that Stack Overflow users do whenever we post on there. Introduce some of the friction back into the conversation. Okay, so
And that's the Stack Overflow also helped us debug.
yeah, absolutely.
Right? So
But
it doesn't exist anymore. AI has destroyed that industry. But
absolutely. So, Amit, you talk about you mentioned how we actually measure, right?
Yeah.
You set yourself up nicely for your next difficult question.
There's more than one question. I should have read.
Yeah. Read all the way to the end. But for anyone who wants to take this as well, we're really good at measuring accuracy, cost savings, right? Some of these objective things. What would it mean to rigorously measure some of these more abstract values that we're talking about? How might we measure something like agency or resilience or your favorite hope? Is there a danger to trying to quantify growth in these values in a way that might actually distort it?
You mean the danger in quantifying these things as they manifest in AI? Like, think that AI is very hopeful. Like, we have hope on the leaderboard now, which you can hear. Like,
absolutely, right? I mean, or hope in its users, or right. So we're talking about instilling values, making our capacities stronger through AI, right? Using as a tool. How do we go about seeing if we're accomplishing that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think again, as academics, we're kind of trained to try to measure things. Construct validity is a very important idea, right? And it's very central to. We talked about academic morality in our ethos. It's part of that, right? And that's why I was kind of appreciated the way Ron's team scientifically approaches that, and they look at it. It's almost like we're doing a meta-analysis of comparing the effect of the AI. So I'll give you one example of what we're doing, and we're definitely not doing anything with hope or and so forth. But let's take the example of with some of our randomized control trials where you do have to measure outcomes, right? And so we're looking at I'll give you two important ones. One that's pretty obvious, which is using chatbots in a call center. Customers are calling in, right? So that one seems pretty straightforward, right? But then the other one is where it's a chatbot, but it's in a mental health context where you have a crisis hotline. And because the call wait times, because the demand, because we have a mental health crisis is very high. So sometimes a chatbot can help mitigate that time, those few minutes before someone else can step in. Or some people just don't, they actually prefer to speak with the chatbot instead of a human, right? So there's actually been, so the question is like, if you have these language models doing it, how do you know that what they're doing could be potentially helpful? And one way we've tried to study this phenomenon, and it's not perfect at all, but this gives you an example of what we're doing, is in psychology, there's a lot of work on what's called trait activation theory, right? So if you think about personality traits, we have them and we apply a subset of them in a different context, right? So how we handle a call with someone who has a mental health, distress versus someone who's calling because their rotimatic broke down again, is a very different scenario, right? And so there, in the human setting, there's research on which traits need to be activated to be effective and how that drives things. And as it turns out, with the language models, you can apply some of those same trait activation ideas, where if you're using these architectures where your model is like a mixture of experts, it's a mixture of personalities, you can look at what personality mixture was applied to the conversation, right? But again, let's think about this. What I just described is very complex, and it only works for some very well-defined research areas. It breaks down very quickly as soon as you go beyond well-studied phenomena where there's already well-established constructs, even in the human literature, right? And so hope, that's why it's a tricky one, because it's not even that well-defined even in that literature. But even then, this gets really complicated very quickly.
Sure. So you said hope. What were the other attributes?
It was just examples, and you want to go with, but I give an agency, resilience, and hope.
Agency, resilience, and hope, right? So it depends. I'm an MBA today. And it depends because it truly does on the context. And to refer back to the example that Ahmed was alluding to on the pedagogy and what Ron was mentioning to fit in ND learning, it depends on are these tools that are available in the classroom today, are they making us more hopeful for learning? It's a human feeling, attribute, etc. Now, and that's how I would talk about them as, or if Santosh is solving the problem of the poorest of the poor in the world and how this helps and increases their capacity, increases hope for humanity, etc. That to me is still a very societal human construct. And the reason I say, and the use construct, deployment construct, context is important. And that's the context that ND Learning is evaluating these tools as well. And the reason I say that, generative AI today is a large language model. What's the underlying machine learning technology for these models? What does it use? Computer scientists and non-computer scientists in the room. What ML does it use? What's the method behind it?
Transformers,
Transformers, and they are
learning models.
deep learning models, and they are. Yes, but they are what? At the core is what? Neural networks?
Yeah.
Do we agree? At the base of all of this is neural network, right? How does a neural network, what is a neural network optimizing on?
Cost function.
Cost function. What is a cost function? Optimizing on what? It's a gradient descent of.
Ritesh, you didn't tell us this is a quiz.
You can answer. If you answer, but then you get points. And Cam will take you out for nice fancy dinner at Roars. If it's error, right? Gradient descent of error. Partial derivative of error. Can you do a gradient descent on hope? Is there a mathematical formulation for agency or hope? Is there one? If there isn't, we can't train a neural network to optimize on that because there's no backdrop function that's going to provide. It comes to the use, how we are using. So I'd like us to sort of think about that as we are embodying these AI systems with these attributes we want them to show, but those are after the fact context or guardrails or constraints that we put on them by design. There's no math behind these things, these qualities. If there's no math behind these qualities, how do I tell them, go out and train all these GPUs so you can do a gradient descent and you can get the error down to zero, you do a backdrop layer, we can do it for cost, or if there's not tan H function for these. So that I genuinely believe it all comes down to, it's not necessarily AI which must have these things. It necessarily is us as developers, as users of AI who must have these attributes. It's convenient for us if in 2 years of these tools' existence, suddenly we are losing hope as a society, suddenly we are questioning what does it mean to be a human. If in 2 years, what have we been doing for thousands of years as humanity? Right? The question is not AI, my friends. It's exposing what we lack. So it's not AI, because AI isn't optimizing on, it's just the data it goes in, that's bias and everything else, but actions it may take, the constraints and guardrails, and some work that Anna's work, which she saved it now, but she did a paper, it's funny, and phenomenal work. She worked really hard on that, where she demonstrated these AI systems have no core beliefs. The humans, she got all the AI systems to agree Earth is flat, 2 + 2 = 5. Barcelona is not the capital of Spain. But then she was interacting with them so much, the next version of GPT that comes out, 5.2, is not giving in to her. They're pretending they have core belief, and so is Cloud, but others, DeepSeek and Gemini, are still demonstrating they'll satisfy her within 5 steps. She has an algorithmic framework for that, so we're still writing a paper. We thought the paper is done. So clearly in 3 months, these systems have learned so much about, but it's not that the internal mechanics, they've figured out how to put the constraints and guardrails around the context that Anna was coming from. I think that is the core that we have to, in terms of human flourishing, is if in 2 years we embrace a technology that's making us all doubt what it means to be a human, something is wrong.
So let's build on that just a little bit. So, part of these large language models, we have the reinforcement learning by human feedback, right? So it can optimize for, if we say thumbs up or thumbs down, right? It optimizes for, do we like it?
Yeah.
Do we like that response? Do you think that, the problem is humans, right? do you think that what we like and what we hit thumbs up for will, as of right now, optimize AI for the right things? Or do you think that just are we too far off?
We all can, I mean, yes, there's a reinforcement, like, the way it happens today is 25,000 GPUs thrown at pre-training these frontier models. Once that is done, then they go to fine-tuning, reinforcement learning, there's human feedback, and they're only using 5,000 GPUs before they release it, or even if they may release it, then they fix it, and they get better. Like GPT 4.0 until 3 months ago was the pride of all GPTs. That doesn't even exist in the legacy models anymore. They're embarrassed by it 3 months later. GPT 5.2 is the pride of ChatGPT now. So there is a lot of these things which are happening, and we can potentially, if we all decide as a society that I'm going to do thumbs up on everything, it's like what the Robin Hood stock market thing was, right? Where folks got together,
GPT to the moon.
inflated every stock price, and people made, and then there were lawsuits. So we could potentially, curate the data to be in particular way, and just before coming in. I think the worst challenge isn't that human feedback. The bigger challenge is going to be until 2022. Arguably, the data was human generated, fake or not fake, human generated. Since then, the data is generated by the AI, on the memes and everything. Ron was, and we were talking about, apparently, if you haven't seen it, I'm going to see it now. There's a video of Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt fighting. Right? Have you guys seen it? No. Only ND learning people are saying yes. And that's one shot. So they're like, of course I have. What do you mean? It's Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. I will have Ahmad and Ron do a fight video as well. Not real. So now that's all part of the metaverse. AI systems are going to learn. To me, that's now we're going to corrupt the data. And to me, that is the bigger adversarial challenge, not our reinforcement learning at the end. Is if the pre-training gets corrupted and you have 1 billion parameters, how the heck you fix that? Everything else I can put a guardrail on. Although my students still tell me that if you put a guardrail, next day there's a Hugging Face open source tool to break the guardrail by the way. So even guardrails are meaningless.
I was just going to add, I mean, I agree with you. I think it's largely a human problem. But when I think about agency, I do think just what you talked about just now does make me think agency becomes more and more difficult because we cannot tell. There's going to be a point where we just can't tell what is real and what's not. And that means, your individual ability to do things it becomes very challenging to know what is real and what is not. And that really hasn't been true before, right? No. It seems like there was always a time where I could dig as much as I needed to find out whether what I'm seeing is a fact or not, right? Is it real or imaginary? It seems like that is going to be potentially taken away. To me, that's not a human problem. That's how these models are being trained and used problem. And I think the other thing when I think about human agency, I think about over-reliance on AI. And that is to some degree a human problem, but it is something we can probably also measure. Like when a model gives something to a person and they go with it and believe it, it seems like you could do some experiments to try and understand how often that's happening. How much over-reliance are we getting on these, with these models? And do we need to figure out how to somehow back out of that so that we actually add some friction so that people don't just go with what they're hearing from these. So I think there are some situations where it's not just completely, the human making bad choices, but it's the human's inability to make good choices because the way the models are trained now. But that's just those are the two things that came to mind.
I'll just share 2 examples. So the powerful couple in economics from MIT, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, they received the Nobel Prize. They moved to Zurich now. So they did a study in India where they were looking at whether kids who are selling vegetables on the roadside, if they can calculate that if they're selling it for 10 rupees per pound, and if you buy 2 pounds, can they do the maths or not? And gave the same example, same test in the school setting in the classroom. And guess what? The answer was that when they had to do the mental math while selling the vegetables or the other items on the road, they were doing the maths correctly. But if you give the same assignment, same problem in the classroom setting, then they were not able to solve that problem. So that's the setting. I think AI, is this a problem of pedagogy, or is it a problem of the quality of teachers, the quality of instruction? So AI could help in changing the learning environment in the classroom for that subset of population. So that's one. And the second, going back to the measurement question, so we are doing a study in one of the largest states in India, Uttar Pradesh, where there's a learning crisis, learning poverty, and we are running a randomized controlled trial where we have two interventions, two treatment arms. In one treatment arm, we are training the existing teachers. They go on a 7 days workshop, and we fully fund that, and we train them how to teach science. And the problem we are trying to solve in that setting is that there's a lack of scientific temperament among school students. There's a lack of curiosity. They do not ask questions. We are trying to change that. So in treatment one, we are training the teachers. In treatment two, we are hiring experts from outside the schooling system. And we have outcomes related to curiosity, scientific temperament, many other outcomes from psychology literature. And as of now, we are not seeing much impact. Even if you train the teachers, there is no impact on these outcomes. And these experts who have been hired from outside the schooling system, also there is no impact. So I'm still curious to see whether there is a pedagogy crisis as well, or AI could be a complementary infrastructure to support the learning environment in that setting. So that setting is very different than what is here, not at any environment does or here. So
But I think that setting is well what Amber was alluding to, context.
Yeah.
This context.
Can I just ask a follow-up? Sorry, are we allowed to? Okay. So I'm curious, did they go beyond looking at the average treatment effects though, or are they looking at heterogeneous treatment effects for subgroups there, or?
yeah, I mean,
They are kind of okay. Well, the reason I ask you, this goes back to that user heterogeneity, and I want to come back to AI with it. But we know there's research in the U.S. where Tennessee had this STAR program. As you know, that's a very famous public data set. And overall, the having the presence of a second sort of type tutor in the room did not help overall, but it did for some subgroups, right? And that's always the challenge there. But I think the other challenge we're seeing with AI with this is that it produces a profound amount of what we call session heterogeneity, because the Gen AI is unlike any type of treatment we've ever seen before. Mm-hmm. Because, and you're an economist, so you're very familiar with the SIPA sort of stable treatment unit variance, but two different people can have a drastically different experience interacting with Gen AI. And it's only getting compounded when we go to multimodal, because now it's not just text, it's the audio, the voice, it's the internet connection, and it's all these other factors that come into play. And so it's actually really making it harder to measure, not just hope, but even randomized control trial outcomes for education and other things. And so my lab, we're doing a lot of work looking at that sort of heterogeneous treatment effect, considering both user and session heterogeneity. And that's become really crucial as well.
All right, we have 7 minutes. Maybe we could open it up if anyone in the audience has any questions they would like to ask.
I have kind of a follow-up question regarding design. I think that we often, when we think about AI, we often think about optimizing, random human tasks, like summarizing one thing or generating an image, a graph, whatever. And I'm wondering, probably following the insights from your research, how are we thinking about AI from the biological perspective, like what it does to the brain? Like we know that, doom scrolling has negative effects in the brain, that using too much of ChatGPT can have a negative impact on critical thinking. And we also know that handwriting is very good for preventing dementia, for instance. So do you know if there are groups investigating the long-term effects of AI usage? And also, what's your perspective on what are the critical, for those engaged in learning, what are the critical things that a human has to learn during early childhood, for instance, for using AI in the future. Like probably most of us grew up analogly, in an analog mode, and we are learning AI. But younger generations are going to have a different impact on how they grow up, how their brain is wired, and they may have different behaviors. We have the social, how is it, like the social anxiety generation nowadays, and so we may see, like different behavioral patterns. And I wonder, what's your perspective when you're designing AI beyond, thinking about the models and the accuracy of the models and that kind of thing?
I guess I'll just say something really quick, and I want to make sure others have time. So, to your point, first of all, it's very early. So, compared to the years and years of data we now have on the negative effects of mobile devices and things like that, it's still good. The full extent of the damage, the jury is still out. We know it's bad, and we know it's going to be really bad. But to your point, though, I think many of us were submitting proposals to OpenAI in December. I think Michael submitted too, and this was because OpenAI, all these recent studies have come out actually saying it's causing their highest activity users. They're seeing a correlation with their mental health decline, right? And it's unclear if that's correlational or causal. There could be other factors at play. Just to put it in perspective, they were anticipating funding about maybe 100 proposals. I think they got several thousand, and they did this on short notice, which goes to show there's a lot of groups out there that are thinking about how GPT is affecting mental health. So it's a huge problem. It's a great question.
In economics, we have started looking at the impact, but as I said, it's too early to see the impact. So we need a further follow-up longitudinal data. But the way I view my problem, or the kind of research I do, is there is a problem, and to solve that problem, or that problem exists because of the demand side barriers, which is at individual level, at the household level, and there could be supply side barriers, which is institution, the system. So kids are dying, the hospitals are not working, doctors are not there. The medicines are not there, the equipments are not working. So I see AI more useful than as a complementary infrastructure in solving the supply side infrastructure gap. That if the teachers are not well trained, then with the help of AI, we can improve the quality of instruction. Not supportive of, in my world, these kids will not have access to scrolling or playing some games or tablets. So I'm thinking more towards to filling that gap from the provider's perspective. They're providing healthcare, they're providing education, they're providing some other sort of services. So there, I think a big role of AI playing a very impactful.
Yeah, can I ask? I really like it as saying AI is exposing what we human lack. So I have very short context window, so I have to write it down on my phone. So I feel that internet and smartphones are just as fascinating as the AI is to us now, right? So, but then we see the children were addicted to web games, social media, and they even got easier access to porn. Then we develop parent control, and we know that's not enough. So we have to pay more time, pay more attention, design activities to build a better relationship with our children. This also happens to teachers and students when you have internet and smartphones, right? So think about before internet, smartphones, how do we teach, how do we do education? So my question is like, when we get into this era of AI, so are we supposed to pay more time, more attention, design more activities to build a relationship with children, with students, and how? And with the technology keeping evolving, will be one day that will be too overloaded to build a good relationship?
Among that's a great question, and I think, in my opinion, we have to be more intentional, right? About with any of these technologies. If you circle back COVID, right, 2021, right? Prior to that, how many of us even thought of converting a meeting on campus into a Zoom meeting? How many of us did that on a regular basis? But then COVID happened. COVID stopped, or wasn't as much of a problem. What continued? Zoom. We tend to lean on things that make us convenient as well, right? So now, even from a parenting standpoint, we can do parental control, screen time, etc. But let me tell you, these kids can break every control you put. Those controls are there so we parents can sleep peacefully that we did something, right? But they ain't working, right? They don't work. Kids may make us believe they do, but they don't. And then if you ask them honestly, they'll tell you that they don't. We are foolish to even imagine, because they'll spoof their IP addresses to break every screen time and parental control and things like that. For folks who have, I'm looking at Katie and just have babies, get ready for the world that awaits you. But I think so. It all comes down to the intentionality, because we will take the most convenient route. It's not that once COVID was over, Zoom and everything else, why aren't we back to what we were 5 years ago? We've forgotten that world because this new world is more convenient. I can be in the confines of my office. You could be 10 rooms down, but I'll still do Zoom with you or work from home and everything else. So I think that's where intentionality, like to date, even if it's an international meeting and Jasmine knows she works, I travel all across the world for one day sometimes because I thrive with people. I need that energy. I need that facial expression. I need the whiteboard, etc. On Zoom, sometimes I'm multitasking. And during COVID, I became so proud I could have 3 Zooms going on at the same time, not one will not. I had 3 Zooms. So Jasmine knows what I'm talking about. He's still like, what the heck? I have one headbutt on something. And, I've mastered the art of it. Context switching is my middle name, right? So that's where I feel you're correct. We have gone through this cycle before. And if we have to just reflect and ask, what did everything take away from? How many of us write handwritten notes versus email? It's like everything we have given a part of something. But who was saying about cursive handwriting, right? There's someone in the audience was talking about, you were saying about this, it's chicken scratch, right? But at least from my perspective, how I write. So that's what AI will do. But the challenge we have with generative AI is it's that mass consumerism. It has far more, I'll use one of the words, but not in the word way that you intended, agency to do so much more with AI. And it can take away, in fact, you set parental control. And your child can create an agent that say violate every parental control my parent is putting on me. And the 2 agents are fighting with each other while you both are sleeping and one will win, right? So I have no idea, my friend. Right, but it is something that we have allowed to be embrace convenience over and over and over again. How much convenience at the end of the day are we willing to take on to give up on something?
I'll just add really quickly. I think it was a great question, Mung. And from I think the kind of teaching and learning classroom perspective, Jim Lang is part of our indie learning team, and he will say, it is important that we work in those relationships. And for example, in the classroom, we do the things that we consider most important in the classroom with our students, right? As opposed to taking the easy way out, which sometimes could be just talking to them for 45 minutes or whatever it is, right? So I do think it's going to change how we educate in a lot of ways. And some of those may not be bad things. It might be changing and forcing us as faculty to rethink what is most important in the students' learning, and do I want to do that with them in the classroom as opposed to having them doing that outside of the classroom where I'm not sure they're actually doing it anymore, right? So I think it's an interesting time, and I do think it does require us to think a lot about those relationships and when and where do we want to build them.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. Look out for the announcement for our second of the panel series, March 18th. There'll be more information coming out about that in the coming weeks. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.